Hello everyone, I'm Hanan Awad, President of Corporita Inc. Under the umbrella of Corporita, we have Corporita Consulting, we have Corporita Academy, and we have Corporita Magazine. So make sure when you go home to Google us and see the amazing content that we put on the web almost every week. So without further ado, let's start. This workshop is part of a pilot project that we started in Corporita as a leadership incubator. So this is the first pilot program and is dedicated to all amazing, aspiring women leaders. Let me start with a little story. Do you know who's that person, that statue? This pharaoh is not a he. He is a she. She's Hatshepsut. 3,000 years ago, she claimed throne, and she became the first female pharaoh. She dressed like a man. She even had a fake beard. And she did this not because she wanted to be a man, because before this point in her history, she's been a queen for several decades, side by side her king, her husband. But to be accepted by the priests, by the society, she had to project herself as, male. She did marvelous things. Actually, for 2 decades, Egypt was prosperous. No wars. She focused on peace, trade, economy, happiness. She built the most beautiful temples around Egypt. And after she died, some people decided to punish her and erase her name from her magnificent statues. Why? There are 2 theories. The first one is the religious people in temples didn't like that there is a precedent of having a female pharaoh. The other theory is that Thutmose III, her stepson, decided to claim her successes for himself. So he tried to erase her name and carve his own name in a state. Thank God that he was not successful to erase everything, and she gave all the scientists a dilemma for quite some time. Who that pharaoh who looks like a woman sometimes, dressed like a woman sometimes, and what is this? And then they discovered that she was the first female pharaoh, and actually the only female pharaoh. Why I'm starting with Hatshepsut's story? Because her story is the story of so many women around the globe who found themselves in a leadership position among, male-dominated careers or something, and they struggled how to project themselves. For many years, I was, dressed in jeans and craggy things because I was the only mechanical engineer among 90 boys. So I had to subdue my femininity, to be accepted, so other people can accept me and feel comfortable dealing with me. And actually it was sometimes as a strategy to protect myself, so I can look tough and act tough and sound tough without looking so girly or sounding too girly or something like this. That's why we decided in Corporita Inc. that we have to create something specifically for aspiring women leaders. You know, I've been studying leadership since 2004. I have read tens of books, hundreds of papers. I did my research. I interviewed so many successful leaders, males and females. And I discovered that we don't have the discipline or the rich science enough yet for women leadership. So we are starting one. And we have today a lovely, wonderful, amazing woman and a friend of mine, Pereira Miranda. It was the perfect start and the kick-off for this program. Carolina always starts by identifying herself as a mother because she feels that motherhood did wonderful things to her, and I believe so. She founded Feminine Harbor to be a platform for women of all walks of life to share their stories, to engage in a dialogue, to learn from each other, and to create a voice of their own. I think whatever, if I spend 10 hours presenting her resume, I won't be able to do justice. So without further ado, please, Carolina, start the presentation.
I'm just going to give you a little bit of context about my background that it sort of is important for the presentation that I prepared to you. So first and foremost, I'd like to always acknowledge the land. My great-grandmother was indigenous in South America, but it was only coming to Canada and in the last 4 years that I've really understood what that meant and what that heritage means in terms of a woman that is now a settler, but who still loves and adores the planet that I live on, and it's a planet that is hurting. Acknowledging that this land here, in particular in this area, was cared for and loved by the Haudenosaunee, Neutro, and Anishinaabe people, has allowed me to enter a journey and create a relationship with the Indigenous people here in our community that really has been one of the most healing things I've ever done for myself. So I really want to take time to honor and to create awareness that we are stepping on land that was not ours, and it was cared for before we came here. And also another piece of information that is important for the context of the presentation that I've prepared for you is that I am certainly a mother. I am a single mother. I'm divorced. That divorce actually plumped me into a massive journey that part of it, you'll get hints of it here. And you will also, it's important for you to know that I am an educator. I'm a teacher, and I am very committed within the work that I do with the board that I belong to. I am committed to equity and diversity. I work for equity and diversity committees. I'm part of equity and diversity groups all over the country in education. And so within that background of being a teacher and committed to education, I am proudly a science geek. I am very, very, very moved by science, first and foremost, but I'm also moved by faith. So, you know, trying to kind of converge those worlds is not always easy, but you will see here in what I have prepared for you that these are some of the things that I find important and that I find that I stick to, which is my truth. And so that's just to say I'm very committed to scientific truth and scientific methods. And I also leave room for faith. I love science, technology, and we're still doing the dance. So Hanan had suggested this idea of like, how about we call it pink and blue and pink or blue? And I said, let's go with that, because there's a book that I read just before I finished my Master's of Education, actually before I started my Master's of Education, which I brought here. It's called Pink Brain and Blue Brain. And Lisa Elliott, she's a neurologist. She was looking for answers in terms of how the brain works and what are the differences between male and female brain in children and in embryos too, by scanning. And so I really liked the title, and I decided to keep that title because it really kind of allows me to tie to her research and talk to brain research, which is something that I'm currently fascinated as an educator. Let's take a look at the brain. So I'm going to start. The brain. I'm an educator. I'm a researcher. I love to learn. And one of the biggest things as a woman is that there's still so much stigma around women being fully capable of being intellectuals, researchers, scientists. I'm raising, not only I am a mother to 2 little girls. And my little girls are avid, curious beings, and they are proud of being intelligent. That's how I'm raising them. But obviously, as we all have seen in the last 2 years, especially, it's come out very, openly, the hostile environments for women in science and STEM and technology and all sorts of intellectual pursuits are still horrific. And so as a mother and as an educator, because I also deeply care that my students actually believe in themselves and that they are able to further their knowledge and their education however they choose to. I do believe that every child's here to fulfill a purpose and their full potential. I decided to take on that war. And one of the biggest things that I've been pushing for is my little girls and my little boys in my classroom are no less brilliant than each other for their gender. They may have different wiring, which we still may not know everything about, but the capacity of the brain lighting up is pretty much the same, regardless of gender. According to Dr. Lise Elliott, there are only 2 facts, and only 2, that really have been reliably proven as significant differences between male and female brains. Most of the other differences are tied to the plasticity of the brain. The fact that our brain is actually shapeable and malleable, and so with a lot of exposure to something that we currently live and experience, it can actually shape behavior and shape the signals in our brain. But the only 2 actual differences that happen even in uterus is that boys' brains are usually larger than girls' brains, and it has to do with testosterone and hormones and how fast they grow into their body and the Y and X chromosome. And girls' brains, they do finish growing about 1 or 2 years earlier than the boys in puberty. That's it. There are differences in adult brains, and when you look at adult brains, there are more differences than just those 2. But if you get our baseline, which is children, really, like especially babies who haven't been necessarily exposed to as much of the outside world as we have as adults, the differences are vastly minimal. It's really not that. You can't tell the difference, really. So, I started questioning things. I'm a very curious person, and I started wondering, what is stopping us to achieve our full potential, our full intellectual potential? So we have a couple of problems. One of them is that our world is old in the way that it looks at the brain. And it no longer serves us because they provide a fixed understanding of what the brain should look like. And the brain is also supple, adaptable, and capable of changing its pathways. Gender differences are also minimal. I posted these 2 images here because, as you will see, for the longest time, I would say even 4 years ago in education, when we were talking about, our students' brains so that they could have metacognitive thinking, and metacognitive thinking is thinking about your thinking. It's a very important thing to be able to do that when you can think and reflect about what you're thinking. Even as early as 4 years ago, this is the image that I would have used with the cogs and the wheels. And we even joke like your wheels are spinning, right? And really, research is now showing through scans and what we know and how we are mapping the brain that there's not really any wheels there. It's light circuits. Light circuits, and they're very fast and they're very adaptable. And they light up in all sorts of areas of your brain. So this changes the way we think of the brain, because even just by being exposed to an image like this, we create an expectation that our brain is set and fixed in its old ways, that there's not much that can change. But when you create a brain image and you are aware that your brain has that image there of circuits, then you can actually start wondering, how much of it am I lighting up? What are the pathways in my brain that I am accessing? What and how do I light up other areas of my brain? And that is a crucial difference in how we present information to our children and to ourselves, because I'll tell you what, as an educator, I was committed to a very new concept in our schools, and that is for the public and Catholic system and all abroad, all across Ontario. We are really instilling a sense of growth mindset in our students. And growth mindset is very new in neuroscience and education. The education field is fantastic because it taps into human potential and it taps into all sorts of different areas. So neuroscience is one of them. So growth mindset is the ability to understand that your brain is always evolving and growing. So our grade 2s and our grade 1s and our kindergartners, they actually know this language. And you can talk to kids, and if you have children in your lives right now, nieces, nephews, grandchildren, ask them, so, have you been learning anything about growth mindset? And they should be able to say, oh yeah, it's when their brain grows. And you realize that there's nothing we can't learn. That is a significant change in mindset and how we understand ourselves. And that teaches children to be resilient and to also have an ability to stay open-minded to what they don't know, and to also have an ability to see things from a different perspective and to find different pathways. And really, it's a navigation system, not more so than the clogs, right? Than the cogs. So you come across a math problem. We use growth mindset a lot around mathematics. You come across math problems, and oh, it's really hard. Most children really think math is hard because that's what they've been used to hearing. But we say, no, but can your brain find a different pathway? And then they go, oh, maybe. And it's fascinating. Well, guess what? I started applying that to my own life. When I became a single mother, and when I got divorced, and I found myself here as an immigrant, no family, I realized I could set myself for failure and just, be stuck in the only version of a story that I knew, which was I was going to be here by myself, not knowing what to do, and probably have to find another husband, or I could say, you know what else can I do? What are the other options and pathways in my brain that allow me to creatively solve this problem with grace? And so that growth mindset, that ability to change my brain, allowed me to really grow an understanding of my own image as a woman and of my own image as a person who likes to learn. And it really shifted how I see myself completely. So it's something that I really hope and wish that everyone, our children are accessing that research right now, but it's something that I wish grown-ups had access to it as well. And if you're outside of the school system, there's not a lot of talks about growth mindset out there. We get some through TED Talks, but not a lot of active teaching and active learning. So the solution, a real understanding of brain plasticity and how the brain works. That's the solution for that fixed mindset. And the brain is not only light, so it's not only neural circuits, but it's also made up of neurons and information, and it's also supple and made of materials that can be rewired through experience and memory. One of the things that very few people know, and also I put a picture of the brain like that on purpose because I really want you to kind of have that image in your brain. You can't tell if that brain is a male brain or a female brain. So why do we think we're less intellectually than men, right? Or why is it that women still think that we can't or not capable of the same incredible scientific thinking and discoveries that men have done for so many centuries and sometimes millennial? We are able to have the same sophisticated thinking as men. It's been systemically taken away from us. Many scientific researches were either, as Hanan had mentioned before, you can actually start, now that I'm attentive to it, a lot of female scientists had taken the time to publish paper, but because they were still a new crop of scientists, female scientists, their names were taken away because somebody else in power was either their adjunct professor, and so they take those women's names away from the research that is published. Some of the most fascinating research that I've read out there is done by women. So, it really started making my brain tick. And one of the things that I also decided to investigate a bit was what is the brain made of then? And the brain's made of water. Most of it, it's about 80% made of water. And there's also, you know, flesh, and it's a very fine material, right? So the reality, judging by current research, is that the brain of boys and girls are more similar than they are described, than their well-described behavior and differences would indicate. And so it's up to us in education to bridge that gap. And so one of the things that I, as an educator, and I think as mothers and fathers, parents, guardians, grandparents, we need to be more attentive to how we talk about our children's intellect and around them too. And the other thing I noticed as a leader and as a woman is how my internalized beliefs about my intellect can affect my children, both students and daughters. So, you know, I used to make jokes. I can't even, because I had to really almost brainwash myself from that kind of stuff, but something as simple as, oh, mommy, I don't know that science is for me. And I don't say those things anymore. If I don't know something, or if something intimidates me, I say to my daughters, well, here's a new challenge. I don't know if I can do it, but we can try. So it's changing our language around not only our children, that stuff ends up being internalized by us as well. So change your language around things that you don't know, challenges that come up to you and you say, you know what, this intimidates me, but I'm gonna take it on, and I'm gonna see how I can find ways in my pathways in my brain to say, I'm gonna try this at work, or I'm going to take a new position. Maybe I'm not fully ready for it, but if I'm not, I'm gonna let somebody else tell me that, but I don't need to internalize that until I try it. Not to mention, you have to also remember, every time you stretch yourself into a position of discomfort, and this is one of the things we've been working with our students a lot as well. When you stretch yourself and you push yourself just enough, not to a point of you're going to have a mental breakdown, not too much past your discomfort level, but when you push yourself just enough close to an edge there that gives you a certain level of discomfort, what you're doing to your brain is you're basically stretching all of those pathways and saying, nope, I know you don't have those pathways yet, but here, let's go for that interview. You may suck, that's okay. Next time you won't worry so much about being in the interview, and you will worry more about the content. So every time you push your envelope a little bit further, what you're doing is creating new pathways in your brain, and you're creating new opportunities in your brain to be comfortable with the unknown. And then the next time you go at an interview, or you go, you know, for a conversation about a topic that is, you know, intellectually important to you, you're just pushing yourself further into actually realizing that you can handle more next time. So, you know, brain plasticity works that way. It's not that different from our bodies. When you push, you move those connections and those areas in your brain that are lighting up even more to light up new pathways. So that's one of the other things we're encouraging our children, is to go close to the edge enough that they still feel safe but uncomfortable, so that you can start pushing the pathways in your brain. So that was one of the biggest things for me, was to acknowledge my intellectual capacity, and that I can just learn about anything. I learned how to be in a new country. I learned 3 languages. And then I realized I've learned so much. I learned to drive, let me tell you. Then I remembered what it was like to learn to drive and how my mother felt about it. So I thought, no, I can learn many things, and I can continue to learn as a woman now. There's nothing stopping me, myself only. And I don't have anyone else also dragging me down, because that's also how you surround yourself and who you surround yourself with, right? And that's the other part which leads beautifully to the heart. Who you choose to love is key in what a leader you become. Because when you surround yourself with people who are not believing in your capacity and your intellectual potential, and they don't believe that your intuition or your brain or your intellect are leading you somewhere, that is going to stop you, because you're going to spend so much energy just trying to prove yourself half right, that you're not really going to put your energy into your brain and into where you can develop further in terms of who you want to be in your community and what dreams you have that you want to achieve. So learning to love was also my next step. So my first thing about, finding myself as a leader and as a learner and as someone who wants to be present in my body was understanding how my brain works. The next thing was I needed to learn how to love, because every time I tried to surround myself with a partner, I really made some poor choices. And I realize now, looking back, that those people were really not nurturing who I wanted to be and who I believe I'm capable of. The heart. Also, I chose an image that is biology because you can't tell if that heart is male or female. Men have as much a capacity to be loving and graceful and empathetic as women. And we have to also break that stereotype. I said to you, I warned you, I'm a big geek, I'm a science geek, and Carl Sagan is one of those authors that I go to quite often, and I have his books and I love him. He was an astrophysicist big in the 80s, and so much of his work is only now begun, like we've only now begun to understand his work, and he's influenced a lot of some of the biggest names right now in astrophysicists, and they're really like some of the people trying to understand the cosmos and understand where we are in this massive universe. They were mostly influenced by Carl Sagan. So he says, with rare exceptions, chiefly the social insects, mammals and birds are the only organisms to devote substantial attention to the care of their young, an evolutionary development that, through the long period of plasticity, again, the brain. So love's a brain construct. Keep that in mind, it's plasticity. Development that, so through a long period of plasticity which takes advantage of a large information processing capability of mammalian and primate brains. Love seems to be an invention of the mammals. This is a very recent understanding for me, and I say recent, maybe 6 months ago. I had a spark in my brain, and I realized, wait a minute, I can choose who I love. I can choose why I love, but I don't know how to choose. And in that understanding of how to love became an intellectual pursuit for me. I was like, okay, I was not taught how to love in a healthy way, because so much of my role models and the women in my life have been attached to their partners through trauma. I come from South America, which is a largely colonized country. So many of the women there were either raped. My great-grandmother was indigenous. It hasn't been a pretty history when we look back, and not at all towards women. My mother and my father have a very healthy relationship now, but when I really look back, there is also a certain element of, there's an inequality of power there. And I see now how so many of the women in my family, they were beautiful women, strong women, but they did become property to a certain extent. And so realizing how much privilege I have over them, I have a very good job and I live in a country that allows me to be free, and realizing then that I have the opportunity to at least understand how to code and how to understand what love is in a healthy, equitable way. So Susana Balan, she is a psychotherapist from Argentina, incredible author, a very, very strong scholar in South America. And she writes in one of her books, which was one of the books and so I started reading about love. One of the books that she wrote is when one of her patients told her in one of her sessions, you know what, feminism served you great and you became independent, that's awesome. But women like you, from your generation, you taught us how to fight, but you didn't teach us how to love. And she talks about that in her TED Talks, and she talks about that in her book, Two to Tango. I also happen to know her personally, so I had a period of time there where I actually lived with her for a month. And it's fascinating that some of her patients were starting, my age, mid-30s, mid-40s, saying, great, we learned to be independent, we learned to fight for our independence, but how do we love? Because all of our relationships are conflicted. And love, as it turns out, when I look at what Carl Sagan has written, it's a learned skill. Our brain, not every species on this planet knows how to love. So we need to take that very seriously, and we need to break it down and learn what happens in our brain, what it is that we're doing, so that we can be loving. Emotional literacy in times when the female power is rising is of utmost urgency. So what is love? How do we experience it, and how does the brain perceive it? How do we wire love and feelings in times when power dynamics are changing? Love is also a neural construct. That heart is beautiful and it gives us signals when we love, but really it's the brain that is wiring that heart, and it's the brain that is processing that information, and it is the brain that is finding space for you to associate and analyze those patterns. May I love this person or not? Is this a person worthy of love or not? Where are the areas in our brain that are lighting up so that we can understand what healthy love is? So the solution. This is one of the books, and I have it right there. I brought some of those books here for you to, if you want to take a look later. One of the books that fell on my lap, and books find me. It's really odd. Like they find me more than I find them. It's like I'm going by a bookstore and then I just feel like pull, and it's like, ooh, okay, what do you want from me now? And this is one of those that found me. And it's Bell Hooks, All About Love, New Visions. And one of the things she says is to love well is the task in all meaningful relationships, not just romantic bonds. And one of the things that I realized is that I did not know how to love because so much of my life was conflicted with the people that should have been there, the biggest source of love, first and foremost, starting with the women in my life. How could I learn to love myself if I had no idea who my grandmothers were as women? How could I love myself if my relationship with my mother was so conflicted and not within any understanding of who she was as a woman? How could I love myself if so much of me was forgotten because it was severed by a culture that tells me constantly that that's not important? So I decided about 4 years ago, unconsciously, and now I know what I was doing. I decided to dig back into my relationships with these women that were the foundation of who I am as a woman. Try to understand their choices, trying to understand who they were as women, trying to understand what they left behind for me to be here, trying to understand what kinds of dreams they had before they became mothers, trying to understand who they loved and who they didn't love, and who did they love before they loved the men that actually eventually became their partners, my parents, my dad, my grandfathers. And it's been the most fascinating journey that I've ever taken. Because what I found were women that I had taken for granted for so long, and women that had done everything that they could with the amount of education that they did have, with the amount of opportunities that they were able to access. So from that corner over here, so from your left, right? From your left to my right. The first one is my great-grandmother, Anna, and she was Native. And I only became aware of that when I was 34. So only 3 years ago. She had 22 pregnancies. She was pregnant 22 times. You don't have time to become and I'm an intellectual. And I dismissed so many of the women in my family because they aren't as intellectual as me. And you don't have time to be reading books when you're pregnant 22 times of your life and you're nurturing and caring for that family. Only 8 of her babies actually lived, which is a tragedy in its own. And so now that I'm a mother, looking back, trying to understand what my great-grandmother went through by living that experience and trying to, and she was of a time where they had to leave the northeast of Brazil because the land was devastated and they couldn't do what they always knew how to do, the traditional ways around the land. They were devastated by colonial practices of farming that basically eroded the soil to a point where it's now a desert. And now they had to move to the city, which is where my grandpa grew up, and became, tried to fit in so badly as a white man with a white, passing tie, and he couldn't. He became an alcoholic, and that's when I realized the story is the same from all the way to the tip north of Canada, all the way to the south of Brazil. It's the same story. The second woman in that line of photo is actually an auntie of mine. She's an unofficial auntie, and she is someone that I had buried in my memory. And when she came back, it was one of the most incredible, extraordinary moments that I've ever seen. It was a moment of memory that I had, in memory, it really manifests itself through your body with crying. And I was sobbing, and she'd always been there, but I had not remembered the significance of her in my life. I was in touch with her as a friend of my mom's on Facebook. But when I remembered, because I had buried, because we bury memories because we need to survive, when I remembered that this woman saved me, when I drowned when I was 7, because nobody else came, because my parents were drunk, it changes your life. When you tap into that kind of memory and you realize that, then I always looked to understand why why is the mother that I am today so different from my mother? And I couldn't understand where that role model came from. When I found her in my memory again, and then I went to visit her in Brazil, I paid a visit to her specifically, I went, oh my gosh, this woman from the age of 3 to the age of 6 shaped who I am now. She was right there. She was an auntie. She was my mom's best friend. And you don't realize that those women are shaping you in massive ways. The 2 women at the center are my grandmothers. And my grandmothers are powerful beyond measure. But we don't look at them as powerful in our society because they weren't highly educated. They were home, raising 4 or 5 children each, and they were baking, and they were taking care of their parishes, and they were taking care of community, and they were loving, and doing all the emotional labor that the men were failing to do. My grandmother, Rosa, who is this one here, closer to me, she came all the way on a journey from Portugal to Brazil by herself at the age of 18 on a boat. And when I think of that, that's extraordinary. But I had to come all the way here to understand that and do the way back. My mom is that incredibly vivacious, full of life person, and people now when they see my mother, they're like, oh, I get where you get your energy from. And I had a very tempestuous relationship with my mother. It was a very negative, conflicted relationship. Without understanding that my mother did the best she could with what she had. She also didn't finish high school because truthfully, my mother is an athlete. She can mountain bike 60 kilometers every other day. And we don't value that in our society, and especially for a woman who is in her 60s. I can't mountain bike 60 kilometers every other day. My mother was a handball player when she was in high school, and then she quit everything because there was no prospect of her dreams coming true, and she got married and had babies. But now I understand that. And she's now gradually freeing herself and going back into sports. And finally, my other great-grandmother, who was also Portuguese and who brought her family over to Brazil. And interesting enough, she says of her land, she always said, I never want to go back to Portugal because that's where I used to be bitten up by my husband. At least here in Brazil, I'm safe because the laws were more advanced in Brazil just slightly at the time. Escaping violence has been the history of my family, of the women in my family. Those traumas, they get passed on. There's a name for it. It's intergenerational trauma. And you internalize them. And your brain relives those experiences. Whether you know you're reliving them or not, it does. Because only when I was able to finally understand what they went through and to recover those experiences and recover those stories and sit with my grandmother, this one still living, my grandmother Rosa, who is from Portugal, and really recover some of her stories, I was able to let go of my anger and say, I don't need to relive this anymore. I can find different ways of loving. The brain is powerful and it's connected. One little picture, that's me, and I posted it there because my aunt, who's my auntie, not this one, another auntie of mine, she sent me that photo in November of 2013 when my marriage was falling apart and I was in deep depression. And I had, as an immigrant, not brought any of my pictures here. I didn't think it was important. It was coming on, getting married, and she sent me that. And it was that picture that triggered this whole thing about memory recovering in me. Because when I looked at that picture, I started crying and I thought, this little girl was once very gentle and loving. And where is she? Because I'm broken. And it was that picture that triggered a lot of things in me that made me realize I need to get back there and I need to know at what point did I disconnect with the love that I'm made of. At what point did I get severed and broken from what I know I am capable of. So this led to a lot of other discoveries, which was mainly, again, intellectual pursuit, but about my body. The body. The clitoris is, I was part of the Vagina Monologues this year when we did it at City Hall. They invited me, I was an actress in a former life, and they invited me to be a part of the cast for the Vagina Monologues. And this was one of the best lines, because I knew this information, but when we said it at City Hall, I thought this was fantastic. And I quote it because it is actually true. So the clitoris is pure in purpose. It is the only organ in the body designed purely for pleasure. The clitoris is simply a bundle of nerves. 8,000 nerve fibers to be precise. That's a higher concentration of fibers than found anywhere else in the male or female body, including the fingertips, lips, tongue, and it's twice the number in the penis. Who needs a handgun when you've got a semi-automatic? This is from the Vagina Monologues. And I realized when I became single again, when I was divorced, that I knew nothing about my body. Experience alone, I knew nothing, but intellectually, I had zero knowledge of my anatomy. I did not know that this is what a clitoris looked like. And in fact, it's actually the same shape, yeah, right? And it is the same shape as a penis, but it's much smaller and more powerful and concentrated in its internal rather than external. Really? Who knows that? Where do you learn that? So again, because my brain is always questioning my intuition and my brain is always curious, I started to want to learn about my body and taking it seriously. So I am one of those, weird people. I read medical journals. And some of the doctors that I know, they're like, oh, I don't know if you're going to understand. Like, no, give it to me. I will. I decode pretty easily. Give it to me. Give me the neurological scientist journals and give me all of it. And it's fascinating because then you start really realizing how much of the female body, the female design body, people know and don't know. And most of the research that we've had about human sexuality thus far is based on the male body, because it's simpler in wiring. The brain is wired very much the same. Down here, not so much. The nervous system spreads differently in the female anatomy and in the male anatomy. And then you have a whole, it's massively diverse with the own diversity of each woman. And there's trans women and all sorts of different body configurations. It deserves way more attention than it has been given so far. We have zero knowledge of human anatomy. We know what a cis male anatomy works and looks like and functions. Female anatomy, very little. So a lack of exposure to proper scientific-based sexual education of the cis male anatomy, as well as a vast lack of sexual experience had made me completely blind to my own sexuality. And sexual empowerment translates to self-confidence. So I decided to educate myself. It is absolutely obvious to me when I look at a lot of Rebecca Solnit's articles and a lot of different things in terms of colonization, sex has been used as a weapon. And it's been used as a weapon of power. One of the first things you will read on Naomi Wolf's Vagina, a Historical Biography, is that when troops or soldiers go into a land, they not only rape the land by destroying it, they rape the women. And it's by raping the women that they get control over that culture. Because then, they colonize it. So to understand the dynamics of sex and how it's empowering or disenfranchising people became really important to me. And the more I became involved with people in my own life, the more I started realizing this is a game of power. And it's a game that we have to play very carefully because we can hurt people that way. We can hurt ourselves that way. So I decided to take it seriously and educate myself. And I believe that the solution to all of this world's evil is education. When we learn, when those neural pathways in our brain connect and we expand what we knew from what we knew before into what we know now and to what we're going to know next, fear then dissipates. Really, the only thing separating a Catholic woman like me and a Muslim woman like Hanan is fear. But as soon as we meet and we sit down and talk, I can respect her and I can love her and I can give her space to be who she needs to be and she can give me space to be who I need to be. Some of the most amazing things this is just the 3 most beautiful articles that came up just last year about female sexuality. And one of the things that really makes me mad, actually the middle one is not from last year, but the other 2 are, is that most of this research, people stumbled upon by accident. No one is putting the conscious intent and effort in studying female sexuality. They discover things because they're looking for something else and they go, oh, wait a minute, what happened here? Oh my gosh, look at that. Oh, women's bodies can do that. Oh, yeah, I know that. I know I can do amazing things. You just don't pay any attention to what I've been saying to you a long time ago. And for example, most mothers who breastfeed, they can't, my eye doctor advised me against getting new glasses for at least 3 years while I was breastfeeding. And I said, well, why? She said, well, your vision is going to change crazy. Wait a minute, you're telling me that my breastfeeding affects my vision? She said, absolutely. Is there any study in terms of why? Because that's certainly by design. If that's happening to every woman in the world, then there has to be a reason. Oh, we don't know much. We just know it happens. And that's how women's bodies get treated. And it really, as an educator and as someone who loves science, it makes me very frustrated because I think there's a world of possibility and infinite solutions to world problems if we understand female sexuality and health. So, for example, scientists recently discovered that children's cells live in the mother's brain, and the connection between mother and child is ever deeper than thought. So there is actual physical evidence through brain scans that have now been indicated that a mother will keep, they've only actually mapped out male chromosomes in the mother's brain because it's different than their own chromosomes, so it's easier to map out. But again, some scientists are quick to say, oh, they keep their son's information in their brains. I would say possibly both, but because one is harder to tell than the other, they've identified male chromosomes in the woman's brain. Well, as a woman who loves science, as an educator, I believe that that's the reason why mothers have intuition. We just don't understand how it works. It's not mysticism, it's not magic, it's not witchcraft. It's designed. We have information about our children in our brain for about 4 years after they're born. It's no wonder that we have very quick instinctual responses. We're probably wired to be connected with that little being. It's by design, but we just don't understand it yet. And that word, yet, we haven't connected those pathways in our brain. Another wonderful research that really made me go, whoa, that is amazing about my body. Instead of reaching the brain through the spinal cord, as previously assumed, female orgasms involve a long nerve that extends into the pelvis in humans called the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is the longest nerve in the whole entire human body. We all know there are differences in orgasms and the way women feel pleasure and sensory information, but we don't know why. Well, and guess what? Men have their information going through their spinal cord from their pelvis. Women take a long route through their vagus nerve, which is connected to all the most important organs in your body. Well, I don't think that's by accident. I don't think that it's then random that women are more in tune with their environment. By the way, your pelvis is the second region in your body, in the whole human body, that has the most nervous connection, like nerves and nervous connections in all of the human body. The first one is the brain and the second one is the pelvis. So it's a powerful region of understanding and messages and systems, right? And recently, and the most fascinating research that I've read, is that researchers now see the egg as an equal and active player in reproduction, adding layers of evolutionary control and selection to one of the most important processes of life. There's been the one fantastic, amazing researcher that's saying, I've got data, not qualitative, quantified data, quantitative data. And apparently in his research, he noticed the egg was actually selecting the sperm. So there's a level of consciousness there that we don't understand how it works, but it's an active participant in how we choose our children. Now, when you start putting all those things together, you go, okay, what's going on here? People don't get women at all. Women are complex, fascinating, and incredibly intelligent. In a world that is very simplistic, we come out as crazy. Brings me to the soul. So one book that I absolutely love is Women Who Run with the Wolves by Clarice Pinkola Estes. So through her soul, though her soul requires seeing, the culture around her requires sightlessness. Though her soul wishes to speak its truth, she is pressured to be silent. This book is one of the very few books that I tapped into that spoke to my spirituality in a way that was authentic. Because even though I was raised Catholic and I maintain my ties to the Catholic Church because it is a community that I identify with, you know, there was more to me, especially before the fact that before I figured out that I had a connection to indigenous traditions, and I don't know how that gets passed down. I think we're far from understanding genetics at this point, but we're beginning to get there. My spirituality was very connected to environmental awareness. And I feel peace and I feel God or Creator when I'm in nature. And when I found this book, I realized, oh, it's not just me. This is something that is about a lot of women. Not all women, but a lot of women identify with that. And so, I started wondering how much of my spirituality was also contrived by patriarchy. How much of that was also, suppressed. And sure enough, these are the three images I got. I got the first three images that I Googled God. And this is the very first three images that I got when I Googled God. Google thinks that God looks like that, or one version of that, or some mix of version of that. And I'll tell you, the other 400 ones were not that different. So, collectively, our limited idea of God is still deeply wired as a patriarchal male figure. It's pretty hard to tap into higher level thinking and creativity and amazing purpose when you're limited to looking up to some image that really doesn't look or respond the way you do. Again, because I am fascinated with science and fascinated with truth, I decided to see what else was out there, but not in a disrespectful way and not in a witchy way. I really am very grounded, and I really do like to keep myself grounded in truth and science, because as an educator, I'm accountable to my students. I'm accountable to my job and my profession. But I like to study. And this came out last year. I'm going to show you an image that really blew my mind away. And I thought, yep, if this is what God looks like, I can see that. And I'll tell you why in a minute. So I'm going to show you a really beautiful video. So this solution, what if to tap into a higher power, we can actually look at something bigger than anything we've ever known, and which is absolutely no human shape, to which we all belong. However, although it has no human shape, when you look at this, again, I want you to keep the brain in mind.
Somewhere in the universe is a small blue planet, the third rock from the star called the Sun, just one of billions of stars in a spiral galaxy known as the Milky Way. But where in the universe is the Milky Way? A team of scientists gathered data on more than 8,000 of the galaxies that surround us. They mapped each galaxy's position and movement in space. And, for the first time, they've shown that the Milky Way is part of a much larger system of galaxies, a supercluster that they have named Laniakea. The Milky Way is nested in the furthest reaches of this structure, on the outskirts. The entire universe can be seen as an intricate network of galaxies, a cosmic web. Some areas are almost empty, dark voids. Others are densely packed with galaxies in regions known as superclusters. Superclusters are the biggest structures found in the universe, but scientists have struggled to define where one ends and another begins. To map our home supercluster, a team led by Brent Tully at the University of Hawaii studied the motions of the galaxies around us in unprecedented detail. Even though the entire universe is expanding rapidly, gravity is also at work, pulling against this acceleration. By discounting cosmic expansion, the team worked out which galaxies are being pulled towards us, shown in blue, and which are being pulled away, shown in red. This enabled them to create a map of cosmic flows, the paths that galaxies migrate along, tugged at a tiny pace by the force of gravity. Using this motion, they came up with a new way to map the distribution of matter in the universe. Delving into our home supercluster, you can see that most galaxies are being pulled towards a dense centre. This is known as the Great Attractor. Our galaxy is among those sliding towards this patch of space, which dominates our region of the universe. Let's take a different view. Each circle represents a galaxy. Again, we can see most galaxies being pulled towards the Great Attractor, in the direction of the arrows. Between the Great Attractor and us, the Milky Way, there's a relatively empty area, a blue void. And next to us is Virgo, a large and dense cluster whose bright galaxies have been observed from Earth for centuries. Until now, astronomers grouped us, the Milky Way and its surrounding galaxies, with Virgo and nearly 100 other clusters in a supercluster that stretches 100 million light years across. But using this new technique, we can see that this is just the tip of the iceberg. This cluster of clusters is merely an appendage of a much larger supercluster, more than 100 times bigger and more massive. But how did the team know how to redraw the boundaries of this cosmic map? Here's our supercluster in black, and a neighbouring structure, Perseus Pisces, in red. Scientists define the boundary as the points where the flows of galaxies diverge, like water dividing at a watershed. This is where neighbouring structures shear apart. This is the first clear definition of a supercluster. Laniakea means immeasurable heaven in Hawaiian, a fitting name for the vast community of galaxies that we are a part of. So now we know that on the edge of a supercluster called Laniakea, in a galaxy called the Milky Way, around a star we call the Sun, there is a small blue planet, our home.
So this video was actually approved by NASA. It's one of the videos that I pulled up from when I follow a couple of their astrophysicists and I follow NASA closely. I can believe that if God looks like that, then we all look like God, because that reminds me a lot of our brains. And then I'm equal to anyone here on this planet, or the Creator, or whatever it is that we choose to call it. We're not that different from one another. Our brains are the same. I have a friend, she said something to me really beautiful once, and she said, you know, I think God, or whatever force that has created us, lives in the parts of our brain that we haven't really explored it yet. And that stuck with me, because the more I learn about brain research, the more I learn about the universe, the more it makes sense. It was such a sweet moment of insight, and she just said to me that to me in passing, and really it's one of the loveliest things I've ever heard. So where do we get with, like, what do we do with all of that? So we get back to the beginning. We have to rewire our brain in terms of ourselves and in terms of others. So unlearning takes dedication and hard work. Rewiring the brain takes as much intellectual, physical, emotional, and spiritual effort as anything. If we can tackle all of these realms of our brain, and we can begin to be more aware of our own unconscious bias, then we can really see, I think, differences in how we see ourselves as leaders and how we see others. We have a problem of unconscious bias. Just today, and I had to redo my presentation, because when I saw this article, I was like, are you kidding me? Just today, there was an article in New York Times. Picture a leader. Is she a woman? This was not, the question was just picture a leader. They gave that question and asked several people, like I think hundreds of people, it was a research team, to draw a leader, and they gave a few prompts. It was overwhelmingly male pictures that came up. Women and men drawing men as leaders. So when you say leader, people think of a man. Women included. Our own internalized misogyny pushes us to draw a man in that exercise. So most people will draw men. Researchers investigated the consequences. And here's something important about the brain. When we process information through the lens of stereotype, stereotype's a problem, real problem of humanity right now. Our interpretation may be consistent with stereotyped expectations rather than objective reality. That's why I'm grounded in research so much. Rationality and objective reality is important for us to really get past our own stereotypes and our internalized misogyny and our internalized biases and internalized racism. So, you know, how do you break that? So how do you break our confirmation bias? Because our tendency is to continue to reinforce our confirmation bias. And how do you break that? So you really have to understand and work towards unconscious bias. So the solution is education. Again, I'm not in education by accident, I don't think, because I truly think it's the biggest antidote to all evils in the world. So the solution is education and diversity. learning to understand, address our unconscious bias in effective manners, even towards ourselves. And diversity is a key component in our shared experiences. So I'm going to let you watch just another short little video on unconscious bias and the magnitude and how important it is. And this is from, I think it's the Royal Society of Research in Britain, and how they are now realizing they have to address unconscious bias.
The unconscious mind is amazing. It can process vastly more information than our conscious mind by using shortcuts based on our background, cultural environment, and personal experiences to make almost instantaneous decisions about everything around us. The snag is, it's wrong quite a lot of the time, especially on matters that need rational thinking. Here's a classic example. A bat and a ball cost £1.10. If the bat costs £1 more than the ball, how much does the ball cost? Most people, including over 50% of students at some of the world's leading universities, get the answer wrong and say 10 pence. The answer is actually 5 pence. Many of us choose 10 pence without thinking. This is because our unconscious mind uses instinct, not analysis. So our unconscious is fallible. It's also biased. It makes snap judgments of people we meet, categorizing them according to gender, social and other characteristics. In milliseconds, we judge whether somebody is like us and belongs to our in-group. These are the people we favor. So men might favor men, while women might favor women. However, we can belong to different in-groups, and we like to be part of an in-group that's powerful, which could mean a woman favoring a man over a woman. That's unconscious bias. All of us have it, and it colors our decisions without our realizing. For example, research reveals that if I were a man, you would be more likely to be nodding in agreement right now, because people pay more attention to a male voice. The Royal Society fosters excellence in science, but this can only be achieved if we select from the widest range of talent. And that's not possible if unconscious bias is narrowing down the field for non-scientific reasons. To lessen the impact of unconscious bias, which is easier for us to notice in others, we are raising the awareness of unconscious bias to members of our selection and appointment panels. We're encouraging panel members to deliberately slow down decision-making, reconsider reasons for decisions, question cultural stereotypes, and monitor each other for unconscious bias. We can't cure unconscious bias, but with self-awareness, we can address it.
This affects our own bias towards ourselves and how we see ourselves as leaders. Before I can even address unconscious bias in other people, these last 4 years of my life, I've taken the time to address my own unconscious bias towards myself, towards the women I loved so much in my life and I failed to see them, towards the men in my life who I maybe gave them more credit than they deserved, and now I see them as more human than they were before. And it leveled the playing field for me, not only professionally, but also in my personal life, to start over fresh and in more healthy ways. So that's what I've got for you. What's your name again? I'm so sorry.
In what you would say about the different modes of education. I'm coming from the perspective of that we learn in different ways. So if we only approach education through research, and also we know that you find what you're looking for.
Absolutely.
Whether or not your understanding of education includes these different ways that we can inform ourselves.
Absolutely. I think this is my take, right? Like you asked that to another person, they might have a different, answer. What I've noticed in my practice and the way that I view is what I hold myself to, the standards that I hold myself to is, there are many ways of learning. Experiential learning is a big one, and I just bought a book called Indigenous Literacies, literacies as in plural, because there are many ways of being literate, and I believe that wholeheartedly. Music. However, that being said, I think the research is important to ground ourselves in truth. When you can, and it doesn't mean that everything and everybody needs to be doing the research or research, but for example, I'll give you a concrete example that changed my life, and why I think it's important. I'm a very sensitive person, and I really always knew that nature and I communicated. And I always felt crazy about that, because you say that out loud and people make fun of you, or they, want to burn you in the bonfire, or you're a witch, or whatever. And those things come to mind, right? Research has now recently proven that trees communicate. So I think the importance of research is that it grounds you in measured information. The problem is the integrity of the research, right? I mean, we know that pseudo-scientific research has been used for horrific purposes and racist purposes in the past, not so distant. So, I don't trust anything just because it's research or because it's coming from an institution, but I do think that there's a valid point of measuring outcomes and measuring things. With ethics, I mean, one of my biggest idols is Jane Goodall. I look up to her, and she's one of the most fantastic scientists that I know, precisely because she says, science and empathy need to find a way to work together again. And so when you bring that understanding of empathy, I think you open it up to all these ways of knowing. But there's an important aspect of science that has to be, science has to have integrity and has to be empathetic, but that measurement piece is important, I think. Without science, we wouldn't understand that trees communicate, right? Like that measured, and Dr. Suzanne Simard in BC, she's a woman that decided to study how trees communicate, and she was very successful at showing. So when you can show that to other people, then it validates a whole lot of other people who are learning in different ways. And that research has allowed me as an educator to, for example, say to my principal or to my supervisor, say, no, I can leave that child, they're learning. I need, as an educator, to show how, and maybe it's through videos or pictures, but you still need, I believe in accountability. I do believe that, especially I work for a system, like I need to be accountable for how they're learning, right? And if they're learning, if they're not, because there's also the fact that some kids are struggling, and you need to be able to identify that struggle, and what is that struggle. And so that's why I think grounding in research and measured, but not everything. I don't know what the measure is. Like, where do you stop? Where do you say, no, they're gonna be fine? I don't know. There's an element of time too, right? Sometimes you just need to give things time to flourish and to come out a different way. So it's a complicated question, and one that I think deserves a panel of, 10 people to answer. Mine is just one way of looking at it. And it's probably biased. I'm just not seeing my own bias, right? So, no problem. Anything else that you'd like to bring up? Anything that you want to ask? I did bring some of the books that I mentioned. If you want to take a look at them, they're not available here at Open Sesame, but these are kind of the books that, and I'm available to chat with you, like if you want to shoot me a message on Facebook, or find me on Facebook. I know, like, email, I lose track of who writes me on email. Like, I can't see their face, and I'm horrible. Like, I was like, where did I meet this person? So if you do want to get my attention, Facebook is probably the best way, or LinkedIn. I'm always happy to share resources and share books and, give you an idea of what else I see out there. And I am a facilitator and an educator, so I haven't written all of my books yet. I'm working on them, but really the biggest work that I am doing right now is showing people different ways of looking at things, showing different authors, because I am an avid reader and an avid curious reader, and someone who's invested in understanding my own reality and my own experiences in terms of grounding them in truth and research. I have a very vast literature that most people are not tapping into. So ethics of care, how the living world communicates. I have tons of articles saved on that. So there's lots of things that I'm collecting and building on that most people necessarily aren't, which I'm happy to share, really, because I think it should be it should be knowledge that is, available to everybody. So, yeah. So thank you. Thank
Wow.
you so much.
I received Carolina's presentation at 1:30 last night,
Yeah.
and I went to bed at 3.
You did what?
I went to bed at 3 because I spent all the time reading the wonderful information she included, and not only reading, I was reading and saying, I believe I gasped last night 100 times. Every time I think of a piece of information or even a new word or something, and I say, yes, it makes sense. And I started to link her research with my research. And it made perfect sense that we collaborated because we saw the world through the same lenses. So this is what we will talk about, trying to tie everything that we learned in Carolina's presentation into something related to leadership that we can learn and apply. So let's take 5 minutes break, and we will come back.